Last month I made a video giving my thoughts on the latest Starfield update, as well as my current feelings on the game in general. In that video I refer to something called the empty space problem, but I don't actually go on to explain it in any way, which was pretty dumb of me. Because I was making a video on a game set in the far reaches of outer space, the general consensus on what I meant was that space itself is quite empty. While that certainly is true, and does tie into the actual meaning I intended, it does blur the definition quite a bit, so I wanted to make this quick video just going over things in more detail. The empty space problem, in the context of open world role-playing games, refers to the ratio between areas of interest and the size of a map. If you have a huge map with very few things of note on it, then you have an empty space problem. On the flip side, if you have a small map that's absolutely crammed full of things, then you might have a cluttered space problem. To put it in the most clear-cut way I could think of, here's two images. One represents an open world with an empty space problem, and the other with a cluttered space problem. The red square represents the player character, and the black squares represent things to check out. Fill your game with too many things to check out, and players will get overwhelmed and feel somewhat swamped, but don't provide enough content and players get bored and feel like there's nothing to do. Like most things in life, it's really just a balancing act. That's the simple explanation out of the way. But this is a YouTube video, so I'm going to end up getting super in-depth about it all, and also providing a bunch of different examples. I was originally going to immediately go super in-depth, talking about relativity, mitigation elements, and other more technical whatsits, but I think I'll save that for nerds like myself who stick around to the end of videos, and instead kick things off by simply talking about a couple of different games and where they fall on the scale of things. Starfield seems like a good starting point, as it's the game I've already mentioned, and I think it's a prime example of the empty space problem. In Starfield, you can travel across entire planets. Just land your spaceship wherever you'd like to go, and start wandering. But 99% of most planets are filled with nothing of real interest. If you do just land somewhere randomly and start exploring, then chances are you'll see some procedurally placed locations far off in the distance, and maybe some minerals or life forms you can scan. But that's just if you land somewhere completely random. Sure, it's a super clear example of the empty space problem, as there's nothing but dirt as far as the eye can see at times, but we can use a couple of planets as more direct comparisons within the game itself. New Atlantis is the capital of the United Colonies, and the lone city on the planet Jemison. Neon, on the other hand, exists in Freestar space, and is also a lone city, this time on the planet Volii Alpha. I honestly think both of these cities in isolation are pretty well designed locations. You could debate for hours which one makes better use of its space overall, but I wouldn't say either suffers from the empty space problem. I also wouldn't say that the planet Volii Alpha has an empty space problem at all, but I would say that Jemison does. The difference is that Neon is built on a water planet. The only part of it you can explore is the city itself. For the relative space that you have access to, it's quite well filled. But Jemison is a huge planet which you can land almost anywhere on. It does have oceans of its own, which do reduce the amount of explorable space available, but not by an amount that will ever really make a difference. The city of Neon makes up 100% of Volii Alpha, so overall, that's a planet with an incredible content to free space ratio. New Atlantis, on the other hand, doesn't even cover 1% of the surface of explorable space on Jemison. Even if we took all of the locations that are on Jemison as standard, and add in all of the procedural locations which could spawn, you still have a planet which is 99% untouched. That's not to say that the wilderness and terrain can't be an interesting way to use the space, just that it's a lot more limited, especially within an RPG. When the overwhelming majority of what your players are walking through has nothing of note, that's when you know you have an empty space problem on your hands. Let's not just focus on Starfield though. It's honestly quite an extreme example of things. So let's take a look at another Bethesda game, one which only deals with the empty space problem in a few areas of the map. Fallout 4. Overall, I'd say the map of Fallout 4 is fairly well filled out. There's a good number of locations to explore, meaning you will almost always have somewhere you can see in the distance and want to head to, but generally you're not so swamped with locations that you get overwhelmed. That's just in general terms for the map though. If we focus in a little deeper, I think we can come up with examples of both cramped space and empty space. I think cramped space is likely the easier one to spot initially, as areas of downtown Boston can get a little much at points. I don't think anywhere in particular goes crazy on being packed in, but I often find myself ignoring locations that I wander past in the city area, as there's already so much to explore. I'd say it's a mild issue, but it is still a case that the space is a little overflowing with locations, leading to most players not wanting to explore as thoroughly, as it can be a tad overwhelming to do so. As for empty space, while most players may first picture the glowing sea, I don't think that area quite fits. It does have plenty of open ground to it, but the unique biome, frequency of enemies, and added gameplay element of dealing with constant radiation makes it so the player is always active. You could certainly make an argument for it falling into the category of empty space in places, but I think a better area to look at is the marshland on the southern parts of the map. Besides Murkwater construction site, there's no locations to explore in the very south. Instead, it's really just a swamp with the occasional enemy. You've already passed Quincy and the Gunners Plaza, and you soon find yourself in nothingness. It's an area where the empty space problem applies, as it's essentially just wasted space on the map. There's no reasons for players to go here specifically, and if they do, they wouldn't find anything worthwhile. That said, I think it's pretty much the best place on the map to have this sort of problem. In order to reach that area, you'll already have had so many interesting places to explore, so many quests to undertake, and different enemies to face, but if you do eventually find your way there, it doesn't suddenly make the whole game feel disappointing. The empty space problem only really becomes a true problem when it's pervasive throughout an entire game. And that's why I've ended up talking about this issue after Starfield rather than any time before. I've played plenty of RPGs which do have some level of the empty space problem. I'd say that most of the Borderlands games fall under this category, as in pretty much every game I have to do just a little too much running back and forth, walking between points of interest with nothing to do but hold down the W key. But it's a minor problem within those games. I don't need to constantly have stuff happening around me when I play a game, that's not my issue here. I've never talked about the empty space problem when I've made Borderlands videos, because it's a pretty minor thing to deal with in those games. Having to walk a little further than I'd like over bland terrain isn't a big deal when it's only from time to time, and isn't a selling feature of the game itself. Starfield very much marketed itself and was built as a game where you can explore hundreds of different planets. There's perks, legendary equipment, and achievements all tied to just walking around different planets, scanning things and seeing what's there. That's why it's only with Starfield that I've ended up bringing up this problem. Empty space is something developers need to consider whenever they're making an open world game, and I'm often impressed by how well it's handled. It can be a way for new ideas to be bounced around, and gameplay elements to be expanded upon. In Fallout 4 you have the junk system, which is a great mitigating element which turns a lot of less interesting areas into places which should be explored. The game also features plenty of collectibles and other things worth grabbing. You can completely avoid name locations in that game and still have a fun and productive time, as you could just grab junk to improve your equipment or search out a specific magazine to help you out. Mitigating factors can be make or break when it comes to empty spaces affecting your game. One underplayed RPG which I've mentioned a couple of times on the channel before is Chained Echoes. This is a game which actually has quite a bit of empty space which you have to run through time and time again, but the dev did something really smart to make that process feel less tedious. As well as enemies placed around, as you may well expect, there's these little orange floating orbs, which are items you can pick up. They're generally quite generic bits of loot, but they're still needed for a few different things in the game, and just by having them floating around the place, all the walking no longer feels like you're just putting one foot in front of the other. You're also out collecting things you need later on in the adventure. For a more mainstream game which also does this, take a look at Skyrim. Any alchemy addicts like myself will often find their walks across the northern region of Tamriel become ingredient harvesting expeditions. Honestly, if Skyrim didn't let you pick flowers, then it would be a significantly more boring game, as a lot of those spaces would truly become empty. These are all mitigating elements. The more of them you have, the less likely you are to be part of the empty space problem. From enemies, to items, to even just visually interesting areas. All of these make places worth exploring and keep the game interesting. At this point, I hope everyone has a good feel of what I'm talking about when I use the term empty space. Sure, it's not the most complex term, but I think it's something incredibly important to consider when evaluating or creating a game that takes place in an open world. But the most important part of it is something which I haven't mentioned yet, and that is relativity. Because the problem isn't technically things being a large distance apart. Distance itself is relative. Let's say the player character runs at about 130 meters a minute. If points of interest are only 100 meters away from one another, then you're going to be travelling for less than a minute between locations. But if those same locations were spaced out something more like 800 meters apart from one another, then you're looking at a time closer to 6 minutes to reach them. But if you're travelling in a vehicle which goes at an average speed of 30 miles per hour, then you cover the same distance in a minute. How far apart two things are isn't technically the issue at all. It's all about how much time the player has to spend travelling. This is why relative scale matters so much. With the case of Starfield, Bethesda kept the player character moving at pretty much the same speed they had in their past few games, but stretched the size of their maps out to a degree I can't even calculate. That's why so many people are excited about vehicles potentially coming to the game in the future. An increase in speed means a decrease in travel time, even if the distance is the same. This in turn reduces the impact that the empty space problem has on the game as a whole. But now that we've established that the problem isn't distance but instead time, I want you to think about fast travel for a second. I won't go too in-depth, as I'd like to wrap things up, but do keep in mind that every menu you have to navigate, every load screen you have to wait for, and every animation that has to play out before you can travel somewhere all add to your travel time, and therefore compound upon the empty space problem. But as I say, I'm looking to call things here, as this was meant to just be a quick video. Hopefully you'll have found this interesting. If you have any examples of games which you think deal well with this problem, or poorly, do leave them in the comments below with your reasoning why, as I do think it's a very interesting aspect of games to ponder. If you enjoyed the video, then leave a like, subscribe for more RPG content, and as always, thanks for watching. Sarge out.